Hi all, so today we're gonna make a little bit different point from the usual. I would like to discuss something mostly related to sources and historical method, um, and relatively to the difference that exists when studying the high and low Middle Ages. So I know the Anglo-Saxon division, that is temporal scansion of the Middle Ages, implies even four different parts. That is the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, the low one, and the late Middle Ages. Obviously, these subdivisions are very different in other countries. The Germans do that in reverse. The other, I think, the French and the Italians have simplified division into high and low Middle Ages, and this is the latter we're going to use for sake of grammar without having to repeat all the time early and high Middle Ages together and low and late Middle Ages together. So let's just divide essentially the medieval history into half. You know, it's roughly a millennium, starting from the 5th century AD, ending in the 15th century AD. So let's say that roughly for the let's call high Middle Ages the moment before the year 1000, very arbitrary and conventional, and as low Middle Ages the remaining part. And this is a topic, I don't know, it might interest people of different kinds, because these are normally observations that maybe just historians who get into sources can agree on, but at the same time, this sounds pretty, elitistic in many ways. I think it can be useful for anyone who is interested in learning history, or maybe is just going to study history at university and is curious about which, what it has to be expected in some way. And in my opinion, it's a very interesting topic on its own in general, reflecting big on many aspects of how we approach history and the impression that we get. Because you see, history is never right. You can argue that even for our cognitive limits, we have literally no idea why we are living, what is happening around us. Throughout our senses and our reasoning abilities, we are able to make a sort of reconstruction of reality that is always the past, by the way, because the time our our brain receives the information from the senses, time has passed. So if you think about it, we live straight into the past by definition. And we have, as a species, an acceptable awareness of the surrounding environment that has been formed on the basis of, how that was instrumental to the survival, all along the ages, and history, therefore, which is something even more complex, because it's basically studying sources of people that have lived a long time ago, and therefore about worlds that quite often we wouldn't know much about, is a it's something even more uncertain, even less reliable, and obviously even more complicated to analyze in itself. And relatively to the Middle Ages, we have essentially this division that I talked to you about before between the high and low Middle Ages, that can't really be done on base of a temporal criterion. Now we are using it to simplify it broadly, but we can say that when we study medieval history, first of all, we should erase from our mind that we are studying such a thing that is called Middle Ages, because not just because people living back then didn't call it that way, but for the simple fact that there is basically nothing about medieval society that makes it essentially diversified from other times in history. You know, you can argue that there are still societies in the world living at the sort of medieval level of of technological advancement. That large part of the Middle Ages was actually pretty similar to the ancient era and to the modern era. So these are all topics that you can debate on. We're going by great approximation here, and even within the same Middle Ages, obviously there were big differences. And the main differences on the base we have divided now, high and low Middle Ages, are, these stereotypical and ahistorical, in a certain sense, idea of a previous part of the Middle Ages in which there are very few sources. We have to rely very often on archaeological data, similarly with what we do for the ancient era. And then there is a low Middle Ages that instead has produced a lot of sources we know relatively better compared to the previous time. And that basically directly leads into the modern era, for which certain historiographies, especially the Anglo-Saxon one, tends to, even if the reason is another, and it's very particular in that context. They even extend, the late Middle Ages, but very, very onwards, very forward in time. But let's say that in general there is this division. I mean, when you study medieval history, you realize that before a certain time, in low Middle Ages proper, the sources you have relatively to historical matters are very few. And that from a certain point, that is essentially the 13th century, you have this exponential proliferation of sources that basically are maintained, at least for Western history. They keep increasing up to our very, very times, and this is so evident and macroscopical to anyone who has approached medieval sources. It's really a matter of numbers, and also of quality very often. And it's very interesting how, and this is the point of the video I want to make, how it really influences the way we'll look at those two different parts of the Middle Ages, and how our history, so our research, properly said, actually is influenced and deformed in a certain measure on the base of this difference. And I will be a bit critical, a bit polemical, because I'm generally a skepticist when it comes to history. Not that I own skepticism as my standard approach to history, but it's always a very good thing to say, as a historian, don't give yourself too many hopes, because what I think the first thing a historian can really do to be a good historian is saying, whatever happened in the past, we cannot know but a minimal unsatisfactory part of it, and the very few things we're gonna know about, it's mostly something it's something we can argue on forever, because everybody has his or her own interpretation of the matter, and you can see that very clearly, even by the fact that every person has a different mind, has a different opinion, and obviously studies history also in different ways, because the sources maybe are the same, but the way you reason on them is different according from brain to brain. And even and it's very interesting talking about the High Middle Ages or Early Middle Ages that my criticism gets into play. I come from an academy, a national academy that is at the moment, but this is pretty much scattered all over the Western world, the Western academies, where essentially people are there is a let's be frank about it. The late antique and early late antique era and early Middle Ages are very fashionable. I want to be explaining the reasons why this is the case. There have been, obviously, it's quite easy to guess in many ways. There are many, this is a moment that is very thought-provoking relatively to, migration, identity, cultures that meet each other and mix each other. So obviously these are topics that are very hotly debated still today in our society. So that's probably the main reason why such a period in history is started, when so often, relatively to the medieval studies, and don't get me wrong, I love that period as well, but as anything that is imposed by fashion and by someone else is dictated before you, I'm not such a great fan. I love the late antique history. I for the same reason, this part in history is so fashionable. I had to study a lot of late antique history when I was at university, in spite of I was a medievalist. And I probably studied late antique history as a medievalist more than the early Middle Ages themselves. And I love the early Middle Ages themselves instead. They're one of my favorite periods in absolute terms in history, because they have a charm on their own. And I wrote a thesis on the early Middle Ages. At least one of my two. I love that period. I love especially certain topics that probably you can recognize from my other videos about medieval history. However, I eventually moved away from it. For the very problem of sources. Then I went up basically with the other thesis into the 13th century, and now I am carrying out research about the 14th century. So I switched pretty much from I can't say the beginning and the end of the Middle Ages, but surely two eras that are, at least in this video, we are dividing quite strictly the high Middle Ages and low Middle Ages, and therefore it's obvious that in this process I have something to say relatively to the differences and to the advantages and disadvantages of studying these periods. And one of the reasons I moved eventually away from the early Middle Ages was the fact that, in spite I loved this era, I instinctively, I can't say, I don't know, maybe it's my taste, my personal life that brought me to study them and to appreciate them. Everyone has a different tastes and different reason for which liking a particular thing in the place of another. However, my reason, that it was a pretty rational one to move away from the early Middle Ages, was in fact the excessive scarcity of sources. Such an excessive scarcity that I basically came to the conclusion, what I'm keeping to study this for, if basically I can't say all the sources about a certain topic, but if there is evenly so few to say. Now, obviously, all early medievalists will tell, but no, it's a prejudice, it's not true. Well, no, I'm sorry. You can make relativism about it, meaning that obviously studying the early Middle Ages is extremely difficult. It's not that everybody can exhaust an era like that in a few years of studying. I think not even in one life you can cover all the early medieval sources But probably not going even so far from that, especially if you mean the early Middle Ages as a very narrow period in time, like maybe 200 years, even in certain cases 150. But normally, the early Middle Ages last a bit longer, depending, especially on the area you're taking into consideration. The problem, so it's obvious that the early Middle Ages are very vast, and obviously there is still so much to learn, to research on, and so on. But it's a period in history in which the sources are so few that basically it's very hard, first of all, that you come up with something that nobody has ever studied first, which means in practice that although you don't find something, some new archaeological find, it's very rare you're gonna, with documentary sources, everything has already been covered by someone else. And you can maybe give a different interpretation to the whole thing. As I was saying, you can find maybe a new archaeological remain that adds a little piece to the whole picture, but it's not that archaeology is gonna solve our problems about the early Middle Ages. We have to accept that what we know about the early Middle Ages will largely remain what we already know about it, simply because sources do not exist anymore. And it's not like in low Middle Ages you can go into a library into a bibliothèque when maybe someone else has already read that manuscript before you, but maybe has not written about it. If you talk about the late antique and the early Middle Ages, all the sources that are there have been extensively studied. And sure, you can do something like reading over and over again a source, like a code of laws. You can study, history that is being written by the great figures of early medieval Europe, but you can try to find, especially comparative history is interesting. It's very fascinating in this sense. But even if you're extending if you're broadening your horizons, it's still, very few you can add more, according to me. But the early Middle Ages has, in this sense, you have to look even at the other side of the medal in this sense. The early Middle Ages are that time in history in which you can do something that you can do with a very few other times in history, namely the probably certain parts of antique history, of ancient history. That is, you can have a broad opinion on your own about the period, meaning that if you study sources about that moment in history, for all your life, you can get to a level in which you are one of the few privileged people in the world who has an extensive knowledge of all those sources, and who can come up with a different interpretation, a broader picture. What do you think that era actually meant, or how things went, broadly speaking, even in especially macroscopical on a macroscopical scale. And at that point, however, it becomes more of a historiographical debate on the great systems that quite often can lead to certain ideological stance rather than a clear idea. Also because at that point, after having studied so many sources, that the main problem is that we can have an impression, and we can have our opinion about it, but we know that the variables that are the base of that are so few, and they can be at the same time, and they're very often largely unknown, and that even in a relatively simple society like the early medieval one could be, there is still so much ignorance about it from our perspective, from through the sources, that you can never be sure what you're assessing. And it's something very disappointing, you think about it, because it's such a beautiful period in history. It's such a fascinating. What I like especially about the early Middle Ages is this idea of transition. You know, if you read people writing in the low Middle Ages, you are, first of all, you're reading them, and you're reading them a lot because they have left a lot. And secondly, it is striking that very often they reason like we do. You know, it's very difficult to find, well, maybe not so difficult, but it's difficult to find certain other periods in history before the Low Middle Ages in which, and especially certain authors that can really, you know, feel close to our way of thinking. There are great historians, like, I don't know, if you take in the ancient era, Polybius, or if you read Saint Augustine. I mean, yeah, you can spot, you know, part of that mentality that is part due to the fact that, you know, we are humans, so we live similar experiences, we pose to ourselves often the same questions, but you can also spot, in a way, you know, part of that more identitary, you know, path, especially in the Western world, that tells you, you know, we come from those guys, and we have grown also thanks to the thoughts of those guys that was read for millennia, essentially, up to now, and that has influenced our way of thinking history, rather than just even knowing about history, because those are the people who basically transmitted through their own work what they had in mind, because they weren't, you know, as I was saying in the beginning of the video, there is no thing like, you know, a pure history, a real history. You know, it's always someone referring to you something else, and in that process you always get something that is being thought by someone else, and the way it's thought makes definitely a lot of difference. The early Middle Ages instead are dumb. They don't speak. And it's rare, because from the very few sources we have, we realize that they spoke a lot in their own times. You know, this idea of the Dark Ages is probably one of the most stupid ideas in absolute terms that you can even think of. You know, the early Middle Ages weren't at all a dark period. And if it is dark, it's only in fact because we have a few sources. So if the sources are the light, you know, there isn't much light, and therefore it's dark, but it ends there. And what fascinates you the most, probably, about the early Middle Ages is exactly this. You know, the knowledge that there was a whole thing going on that we can't track, however, because we don't have enough sources. And it was a moment in which, in a way, great part of our modern identity, especially as Europeans, and, you know, all who came from Europe eventually, was being formed. So it's very important to think about passing from polytheism to monotheism, or passing from, you know, the Holy Roman excuse me, I was thinking already about the Low Middle Ages, passing from a statal structure like the Roman one, with a decent level of literacy and, you know, a word of function in a certain way, to something very different, to something that often went back to its tribal roots, that wasn't, however, the same thing. And this very extremely fusion between the Romans and the Germans, and how their cultures eventually shaped the one, at least of Western Europe, the most, but take even, I don't know, the Slavs, who remain in the darkness, in the sense of the sources, for a much longer time, and yet they were the people who make up today, you know, the eastern half of Europe, and they had their own history, their own identity. We know nothing almost about them up to a certain point. Certain countries in Eastern Europe don't start even, knowing a satisfactory production of sources up to the same low Middle Ages and beyond. So it's really dramatic. It's sort of love and hate from this point of view, the early Middle Ages, because it's so fantastic in many ways. It's so fascinating, but at the same time we know too few. So I realized there are people were fine with that. I know many early medievalists. I know people, as a matter of fact, and colleagues who instead did the opposite thing that I did. Starting from the low Middle Ages and coming from the early Middle Ages. I know even a contemporary historian who came to study the late antique world. Very, very, risky choice. But it happens. But so that depends on the person, depends on the student and the learner and the scholar. In my case, for my sensibility, especially for my need to try to see it. I can't say clearly, because obviously that would be kind of contradicting myself, because we can't know. I said we can't see history, very well and understand it as it was. But at least, having, something to work on and something complex, and trying to figure out and trying to get, an understanding that even goes beyond the 2 or 3 sources that you have, which is a more challenging task indeed. I couldn't tolerate to remain into the early Middle Ages. I still read about it, of course. I haven't abandoned it. I think we should always study all history if we want to be very good historians. But that is not often possible sometimes, because our same academic duties prevent us from doing that. By the way, it's the same academy today that is shaped in a way that it's not very satisfying from that point of view. There is a hurry for hyper-specialization, even for selling history, that it's not extremely it's not extremely deontologically correct for the results. History is living, in a way it's made, is living, according to me, a crisis, which is pretty serious. However, my sensibility pushed me for the low Middle Ages, for a moment in which I can really see better certain things. And telling the truth, before studying the Middle Ages, I had myself, I'm not ashamed of saying this, that I had myself prejudices towards the early Middle Ages. Not because I disliked them, they were still fascinating to me, but I had other prejudices, and I was more interested in about the low Middle Ages. I'm not explaining why, but just for telling you why I moved back to the low Middle Ages, it wasn't automatical. Because when I eventually started to study medieval history, I immediately fell in love with the early Middle Ages and kind of neglected the lower one. And yet, at the end of my degree, I came back on low Middle Ages for my PhD, and I'm currently focusing on that. What are instead the advantages and disadvantages of studying the low and late Middle Ages? Well, I was complaining that there were too few sources. Well, problems in the early Middle Ages, problems solved. In the low Middle Ages, you start having too many sources, and that's an equal challenging problem, because there is a problem of time. If you want to go to achieve good results, you have to unavoidably narrow your focus of interest, because if you want to study something very in depth and very well, in order to understand it and not leaving everything to the chance and trying to cover all the sources, you have to restrict your field of interests, which to many to people, especially coming from the early medieval history, feels claustrophobic. Mm. And there is this tendency to specialization in the low Middle Ages. And at the point that you lose the plot, we can say, in the sense that remember when I was saying that the early Middle Ages are this moment in which you can have at least a very large, view of the world, because the sources are few, so at least you can see, macroscopical affairs. At least you can reason on a macroscopical scale in spatial and temporal terms. In the low Middle Ages, you start losing that. And you wouldn't like to do that, because everything seems so much better when you look at from the above. But unavoidably, for all the number of sources you have, you need to, if you want to carry out a good research, you have to go in depth into the sources, and that distracts you from everything else. So this is typical of low medievalists, that they are maybe extremely sophisticated historians who know everything about their own specific field of research, but they are completely ignorant even of the same world they're studying. If the topic exceeds from their local perspective or even temporal perspective, you can. Once this is funny. It's an anecdote that I can tell. I was researching about the history of a city in the 14th century, and I was studying the first half of the 14th century. So I didn't know much about this place, and about the relative historiography. So I wrote to a professor that I knew was expert, of the 14th century history of that city. So I would say that's fine. The answer I got, very, in a very snobbish way, was something like, "Well, as I presume you already know, I'm an expert about the second half of the 14th century for that city, and not for the first half of the 14th century." Well, yeah, but I just asked you, relatively to the historiography of that city for that era. You're so specialized into the second half of the 14th century for that city only, that you can't give me any good advice for, the historiography of the first half the 14th century for that city. I mean, it's always that city. If you want to study, what happened in the second half of the 14th century, I think you're supposed at least to know what happened just in the generations before. Otherwise, what do you study it for? Well, this is the things that really happen. Telling the truth, they happen also for the early medieval age, as well as any other period in history. But in fact, I have the impression that the more you go on in time, late Middle Ages, modern history, contemporary history, you find people who know just their own tiny part of that, and that they ignore the rest. And I can't understand it for contemporary history. Contemporary history has such a huge amount of sources for even the smallest things, that you're obviously and they already go by great approximation at that point, because otherwise they wouldn't make history if they stayed just even in a very narrow space. But I mean, there is no living being who can learn about the history and the sources of the World War II, for instance. No one can. You need 300 lives to do something like that. In the low Middle Ages, you should be, however, at least aware that of things that happen into the surrounding times and places. So I was pretty surprised to receive to have received that answer, and eventually solved the problem by finding what I I needed from historiography. But just for telling you how, academies are transforming into, you think that scholars and professors are highly cultured people. They aren't. They aren't. They're just how do you call them? Specialized workers that do that job just because they have to publish something, and then they're completely ignorant about the rest. And often they are, and this is all over the Western world that is objectively the most advanced. Think even about the rest of the world and what a mess it can be. So sometimes it's really disappointing even to look at the academic world and saying, oh, maybe these people can help me. I develop a certain attitude that favors instead the idea of, looking at things on your own. And I think this is a good advice I can give. I personally was never satisfied with anyone explanation. Since I was a kid, when you ask your parents about, how does an airplane work, and they give you that explanation that is usually lazy and incomplete, and you immediately smell that that's not what you wanted to be replied, and I kind of feel this same impression when I look at my at scholars and what they read and what they say, and I always found better to find out things on my own, even making mistakes, but at least knowing that you can rely on what you do, hopefully, and you can see clear into things, because what, history is becoming something like, not really telling it all, by making very pompous speeches and premises and introduction, and eventually saying nothing concrete. And this is what you find often in certain contexts when history is being studied so long, so intently. Then someone else arrives and wants to sell a book, so maybe he writes something extremely stupid to pretend to have find out something new, and just to sponsoring himself. And eventually, however, I know, hoping what, because if you say something stupid, there is a whole academic community who is gonna eat you alive, literally. So at least in my opinion, however, there should always be a kind of very autonomous process of learning and a very independent-minded attitude when approaching history. So first rule of history is never trust anything. Don't trust sources, even less don't trust historiography, and always try to look beyond if you can. Always try to form your own opinion and not let other people telling you what to think. Obviously, the good advice of a good professor, of a good trusted colleague is always welcome, of course. I don't want to say that we should make war within each other, even if it already happens, because the academic world is extremely violent, it's extremely competitive and polemical, and very often for certain ideologies rather than for actual history, and this is something that I don't like for my tastes and my times. But it happens, so just be aware that consensus in historical matters has always been sort of chimera or something very similar to it. We can at least be satisfied by the fact that historiography has bettered over time. Today we have a much more reliable historiography than we had 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So if this is the tendency, overall we can stay at it. So coming back to the low Middle Ages and trying to conclude also, because my monologues are extremely long sometimes. I don't want to bore you. the low Middle Ages is beautiful because effectively you can start having a good understanding of many prospects. Talking about European history proper, the real turning point, however, with sources is the 13th century, and probably the 13th century is the best century of all, because there aren't so many sources, but there aren't so few either. So you can start, there is a good balance. From the 14th century, the sources began to multiply exponentially, so the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages are pretty messy under that point of view. But at least, if you want to study something, there is enough to say, enough to look at. The only problem, as I was saying, is that, especially if you carry on a research, you have to be quite precise. So in order to be so, you should check all sources. This is the minimum that is required to a historian, which sometimes can be very boring, because sources first of all have to be found somewhere, and until we talk about the early Middle Ages, most of them are all you can access to them quite easily, quite openly. For the low Middle Ages, it's a bit more complicated. You should go into an archive to move you physically. When archaeologists criticize historians by saying, "Oh well, you stayed sitting on a chair all the time long. We are digging here in the mud." Well, yeah, but at least we can't say that. At a certain point we have to take trains, going to cities, checking archives, and very often for nothing, because this is also the idea that if you have scruples, very often it happens that you lose a great amount of time for finding sources that you realize by reading them, by analyzing them, that they were not maybe worth the trouble, they didn't help you at all. But however, at least you have something to ground your theories on. At the same time, however, sources in the lower Middle Ages start to really be too many to be covered extensively by, and if you really want to look at certain phenomena that they're not just local, but have a broader, horizon and scope, things start to get a bit complicated, or at least you should try to do something different, and you're pushed to do it, but it's always a risk, which is you start to have, you must need a great ability of abstraction, which is very difficult to do, because you can't abstract history. Abstraction means that you have to abandon sources? No. But let's say that especially when you have read many sources at once, and you start getting certain impressions that you can't really, demonstrate by putting sources together, but it's a sensible feeling that you have by having read all the sources, that there is something going on there in that part of Europe, on a regional scale, a social level. And if you have a good mind, if you're a clever person, you can try to do such an hypothesis that, even though remaining such, or maybe forming the bed for someone else eventually, studying it in your place, that maybe it's correct. I am currently studying lots of sources that are comparable in many ways, because they are mostly chronicles, and I know that there are a lot of prejudices towards chronicles, but it depends where and when in Europe they have been written, because once you think about the monastic source chronicles that are typical of, especially of Northern Europe, of societies that were less developed, and still lead to these feudal assets, it's one thing, and there you can think that those chronicles are written for someone to say something very precise. If you look to Southern Europe, to very dynamic and more egalitarian societies, you start noticing that there were commoners writing chronicles, and those are extremely are extremely reliable, if anything, because we have many of them written by very diverse people from very diverse places. And what you notice is they all wrote the same way, so they all present a frame that, in spite of the individual characteristics of the authors, really tell you that and really show you a very clear system that is there. And at that point, given that frame, you can start to make hypotheses on a broader scale, and by saying, I don't know, this society was in crisis, let's say economic crisis, or military crisis, or political crisis, whatever, or maybe it was increasing, or maybe look, this city was on the rise and this other wasn't, etc. Well, that is really matter of being able to read the whole picture as well. And it's much more difficult than doing it for the early Middle Ages, as we were saying, but you can have very good satisfactions, can get very good satisfactions when you start to put your thoughts together and sources together, and you start seeing that there is a structure there that works for that theory. And that's a bit, what all historians do in the end. And now I'm saying it from the perspective of a low medievalist, but this is what we do really as a job, and it's nice when the numbers turn out to be good. And yet you never have the the complete security that what you're reconstructing is reality. You can never have it. So maybe, and before you realize that, the better you feel as a historian. So obviously, as we understood these two periods in history, yet history to be written in very different ways. If you read especially those great encyclopedias that have been done, like about medieval history, about the Cambrians and stuff, that are written usually by essays. It's not that they make a very long history, but they try, like in the manual, but they try, there is every expert of that particular field that adds a topic on its own. You can't find very clearly the difference between the earlier and lower Middle Ages from the topics that they have. The early medievalists write essays that are, we're talking at parity of length, that are much more filled with sources, because obviously they have just those, so they can't go away from them, and they offer at the same time a picture that is much broader of the world of those times. You start reading those essays from lower medieval medievalists, and you realize that once again, at parity of length, they're much more they're much narrower topics. There is a much higher degree of specialization, and overall you lack the overall point of low and late medieval history. It's as if that took all branches corresponding, or infinite branches corresponding to the various specialization, and you see crumbling that whole omnicomprehensive picture of Europe or European history at that time, the way you could find it for the early Middle Ages in the same encyclopedia. So that is pretty evident, and it's not good. I mean, we should try to be much more. I'm one of those historians who believes that comparative studies are extraordinary. What you can get from certain societies and from certain, the idea of looking at broader pictures, especially for the low Middle Ages, is one of the more fascinating, challenging tasks that, by the way, reveals also the quality of a historian as not as a specialized worker that makes research into archives to to get that paper finished, but as someone who is able to look at the society and trying to understand how it works. A true humanist, a true philanthropist in a way, or a philosopher, how you want to call him. And at the same time, there is a risk because we have developed this nightmare idea of teamworks. You know, the idea that at a certain point in certain parts of history, data starts, so sources start to be so many quantitatively that you can't work but in team. Now, teamwork is crap. Let me tell it to you straight. It's complete rubbish because it's basically working on a statistical base. Every historian works the same way, brings into the team data that other team members don't know nothing about. They try to package it all together with statistics and stuff. Nobody knows what they're doing, and then they sell this thing that maybe because it's really sold. We're really talking about money, and that's the reason why we're doing teamworks. And teamworks are destroying our history, because these teamworks belong to these sick mechanism of call for papers, for which you have to pay to participate, hoping that they will put your paper into a book and get it published. And that has nothing to do with history. That has nothing to do with the quality of the work. That imposes terrible times on historians, terrible pressure, and the result is that the work is complete and utter rubbish. Historians have to work for pure philosophy. They have to work because they have to see clearly, they really have to find out what they have been questioning, because that's the only one. And that takes time. That takes a lot of time, and you can't do a historical research just for the sake of watching your paper published on a book, just for saying that, not that you wrote something good, but that you wrote something that is published. That's rubbish, and history is declining. The quality of historians that we are making in our days is always lower. And I don't know, this is a very serious issue to me. I will probably dedicate another video to it, but it's really a big problem in today's times. And that starts from the idea of making things quick and fast, and not give the time as it's meant to be. So this was a bit of a rant, and oh god, almost 53 minutes. Well, I cut it out. If you listened to me up to this point, I'm very glad about it. I hope I haven't annoyed you with my thoughts. If you like this video, please share it. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel. Leave a like, whatever you feel yourself to do. And if you have any question, please comment my video or write me an email. So I wish you a nice time, and to next time. Bye.